people in and we'll just have a nice chime. For
Mom, put it down.
Like light connection that she actually like.
All right. Hello, everyone. Just working on getting, if anyone on the call has a Mac and knows how to turn off the waiting room ding, please put it in the chat, and then that won't be, we won't have a chime going throughout the throughout the talk. But otherwise, I really want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is the second of a three-part speaker series on gender, sexuality, and human rights. My name is Rachel Lowen-Walker, and I'm the Sallows Chair in Human Rights with the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm joining you from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory. This is traditional lands of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Nakota, and Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I love the fact that with these online talks, we have expanded our communities, and I know that we have people joining us from well beyond Treaty 6 territory. So I invite you to say hello and let us know where you are from in the chat. Now, before I introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, I have two logistical items. Number one, we're going to save all questions to the end, at which point I'll invite you to put them into the chat. And I will moderate from there. And number two, I want to let everyone know that the talk is being recorded. And so it will be made available on the College of Law's website following the talk. So no need to take detailed notes, just sit back and enjoy. So without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's guest, Dean Spade. Dean is an associate professor at the Seattle University School of Law and has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He's the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. And as an aside, I had the good fortune of teaching a class on gender, sexuality, and human rights this term. And this book was one of the first that I turned to as I prepared the syllabus, and the students loved the work. Dean is also the director of the documentary Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back, and the creator of the Mutual Aid Toolkit at bigdoorbrigade.com. Be sure to check it out. Dean's latest book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, was published by Verso Press in October 2020. As a queer scholar, I will say that there are few relevant legal conversations in the field out there that don't draw in Dean Spade's work, and rightly so, as he has the expert ability to bring theory, law, personal narrative, and social change together into productive conversation, a skill so needed today and well into the future. Spade's talk tonight is titled Facing the Limits of Law Reform in These Times of Crisis. Welcome, Dean. The screen is yours.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Rachel, and to everybody who worked on organizing this. I'm calling in from Tongva land in Los Angeles, California, but I usually live in Seattle, Duwamish land. But the cool thing about teaching remotely is that I can spend some time in the sun. So yeah, I'm going to share my screen. I'm really excited to talk to you all. It's fun for me to go specifically to talk to people who are connected to law schools about kind of bursting the bubble of the ways that I think our cultures generally often lift up law reform as the way to freedom and liberation, but also specifically, I think that gets pretty uncritically questioned, at least in American law schools or US law schools. And I think it's also true elsewhere. And I also just want to apologize that to some degree, a lot of my examples and a lot of my experience is US based, but I think parts of it are really applicable to the Canadian context. And obviously both, Southern colonial nations, both engaged in a lot of similar harmful military border and prison practices and colonial practices. So I hope we can figure out what some of the overlaps and differences are together. Okay, just gonna set this up to properly share it. Okay, hopefully that's working and you can see it. All right, so I wanted to just start out by talking about some of that exact thing I was just mentioning, the ways that there's a lot of mythologies about how social change happens that I think really are designed to actually demobilize our movements and make them less effective. So I just want to name some of those. These are like background frameworks for me, and you know, it'll be interesting to hear what you think of them. So one sort of a primary myth about social change that I am concerned about is the myth that social change happens through legal change, through elections, and through charismatic figures. You know, in the US, this is often told as a story specifically about anti-Black racism and the idea that anti-Black racism has been ended by legal change is like a big idea. Like, oh, like slavery was abolished, explicit de jure apartheid was abolished, you know, anti-discrimination laws were passed, so the US can't be actually racist. The US is a state that protects against racism. And that, of course, is so counter to what we all know. I think what the world knows about the US is, which is that anti-Black racist state violence is, you know, an enormous part of the functioning of the US and has been from the beginning, and is really constitutive of the US. But part of that way that story gets narrated is through this celebration of the civil rights era and this framework around these laws that got signed and this idea that the US like transitions to become this protector of Black people. That story is also told about protecting people with disabilities or protecting women or to some degree protecting queer people or trans people. It's interestingly not really told about Indigenous people because you know, colonization is constitutive of US law itself, but there's certain kinds of like silences in the mythology that are part of it. But this story is just told again and again and centering courts and centering elected officials in ways that I think are really problematic and really, one of the things it does is it makes everybody into like passive observers. Like if you're not somebody who can make the law change, or if you're not somebody who's going to be an elected official or like that leader, then there's nothing you can do but kind of like just passively like vote for them or wait for them to do something. And so that's like a very intense demobilizing tactic, I think, that narrative that like turns us all towards the elites. Another big myth is that the like way to make change is to start with the least stigmatized people, and that's pragmatic, you know, so that like if we're going to fight for migrant justice, we should center you know, migrants who are, you know, valedictorians who've served in the military, who came here as children and it's no fault of their own, and you know, all these stories about that. And or we should center trans people who people think of as not trans, or we should center white rich gay families or whatever. That's the way to win. And I think that actually is it's the opposite of pragmatic, right? Because when you win things for those very special people who are the most aligned with hierarchies of evaluation, you haven't won anything for the other people in the group. And in some ways, you've often like reified the stigma applied to the other people in the group. Whereas if you win things for people who are most multiply targeted, you inevitably improve things for everybody above them. And I think of this kind of thinking as like an anti-intersectionality is often what this is. It's like, let's find the perfect plaintiff or the perfect person for the media story who makes everyone comfortable and doesn't raise people's, you know, deep devaluation of so many different groups. Another kind of problematic myth is that we should all work inside the system. I see this a lot with law students who've been told like, if you're mad about police violence in the US, you should become a prosecutor. This is like a really common idea in US law schools, that like you should go inside the system, and they think that they're gonna like be able to make some kind of change, but of course they will just be doing exactly what prosecutors' jobs are to do, which is to put poor people and people of color into prisons. But that notion that all the change happens through the inside is a very harmful notion. And my belief, having spent my life participating in social movements and studying them, is that the most significant change comes from outside pressure, and that the last thing to respond is the inside or the law, or the, you know, the moments that we see that get celebrated where somebody signs a law or a big court case comes down are like the last thing to change, because there's been enormous sustained you know, bold pressure, bold action from outside. And usually those things, when we get them, are like inadequate concessions that don't actually resolve the problems that movements were concerned about. We're also always told to look at like the national scale instead of the local, and that's where the action is. And so in the US, that looks like a kind of obsession with the national elections and a like real sort of celebrity sort of vibe around those. But of course, the most change is possible at the most local level, right? Like it's very, very hard for people in my own community to like make a change on what like is happening in the Department of Justice of the United States, but we could actually try to defund the police in Seattle. You know, we could try to stop them from building a new jail or a new police station in one of the towns right in our region. You know, so it's that question. I know that's different to some degree in Canada. What is provincial versus what is happening at the municipal level versus what is happening at the level of the whole government. But I think, you know, it's a common it's like national politics are like elite. People are like they're special, and like local or provincial politics are, you know, less important, and people often don't even know who elected officials are in their own area, whereas everyone knows the name of the people at the top. And then finally, there's a myth that the way change should happen is through centralized strategies. So like in the US, the myth is that like the way the myth works is that the ACLU is the most elite you know, legal group because they have like a national group and then they have these chapters, and you know, or Planned Parenthood, like these kinds of like centralized big organizations that like sort of unroll their standard plans across the country are the way to like make change, and that really replicates the model of the colonial nation state. And I would argue that the most effective work is actually happening from autonomous organizations working at the local level with local wisdom and strategies and organizing that then are connected to other groups, but then are not like we all have to do this the same way or we all have one central boss, but instead are really dynamic. And there's a lot of evidence that in social movements, when things are more centralized, it's easier for the government to infiltrate them. It's easier for them to be taken down. Whereas when things are autonomous but networked, they're more resilient to the kinds of attacks that social movements are constantly under. So a lot of my work has been about like just thinking through why legal reforms are inadequate. And so I just have like this basic slide about kind of like the key common pitfalls that we see. You know, what I'm trying to answer here is the question of like, why doesn't changing the law change people's lives enough? Like how could the United States have become a country that, that under its laws, it says that racism is illegal, that sexism is illegal, that ableism is illegal, that the government and the police are supposed to protect you from those things. And yet in the period when we've seen all of those things become illegal and supposedly protected, we've seen a drastic increase in the racial wealth divide, the gendered wealth divide and wage gap, and also like a drastic increase in like the actual apparatuses of racist state violence, like, you know, how big the policing and prison systems are, how intensely militarized the border is, how many people are in cages. So how come those things go together? Like what's wrong? Why doesn't getting the law to say a good thing about the hated group fix it, right? So there's a lot of different ways reforms can be problematic or inadequate. One is that a lot of reforms just actually offer no material relief. Like, you know, when Trump was elected, the elected officials in my state, in Washington state, got together and had a big press conference, and they declared Washington a hate-free state, and they all got up and gave speeches about how they loved trans people and Muslims. You know, like it was like they were all like, look, we're not Trump. But declaring Washington a hate-free state literally does nothing for people in Washington who are targeted. And those are the same elected officials who are like literally expanding prisons and helping ICE put people into deportation proceedings, and who are like conspiring with you know, housing developers to build more luxury housing while people become increasingly unhoused. You know, so it's just like it costs them nothing. And so there's a lot of things like that. Like a lot of times the first thing that institutions and governments will do in the face of pushback is they'll declare some kind of anti-discrimination policy that just like is unenforceable or is like so vague, but it's just like, no, we like those people. That's what we stand for. And just like it's a brand change that kind of does nothing. Sometimes reforms come with relief that only reach the least marginalized people in the affected group, you know? So it's like, oh yes, this is a pathway to immigration, but only if you have these really specific kind of jobs and have never had contact with the criminal system and have never done this and that, you know? Oh, maybe there's a way for this set of people to bring employment discrimination claims, but you have to have all this kind of documentation that low wage workers would never have. So it's really only for like these few elite workers or things like that. So that's a frequent problem with reforms. In general, a lot of reforms just end up being window dressing or legitimization of the very systems and institutions that we're trying to dismantle. So it's like, oh, wow, look, they hired a trans cop, or like, oh, they've hired cops of color. So that's a frequent dilemma, is that it actually is just like good PR for the very systems that we want to take down and that are killing our communities. Many reforms sort of just really tinker and don't reach the root causes of what it is people are complaining about. At worst, reforms will often expand harmful systems. So not just like failing to make a change, but actually making them worse. Like if we let trans people serve in the military, then there's more people in the military, right? Or if we expand police to hire more cops of color and women cops, then they just expanded the police budget, you know, and then they were going to like add another training to make cops supposedly sensitive, and then they just expanded the police budget again, and they gave them all overtime to go to the training. You know, a lot of these things, or like if we pass new laws that say it's, you know, a worse crime to attack people for being queer and trans, or attack people for other stigmatized identities, then you've just added more punishing power to the prosecutor and more people will go to prison. Or if they're like, oh my God, the prisons aren't safe for women, let's build new, more gender responsive prisons. We've just expanded prisons. So this kind of reform that actually digs us further in is really common. And then a lot of reforms, which I think it's kind of in the themes I've already mentioned, do this thing where they tell us who are the deserving and the hated group. So, you know, only immigrants who haven't had contact with the criminal system, or only immigrants who've been able to figure out how to go to college and afford all of that since they're not eligible for financial aid or whatever. And so then you get like these really harmful divisions that reify stigmas on some people, and they also divide the group, because like some part of the group is going to get something out of this, usually the group that already has the most voice because they're the less stigmatized part of the group. Some examples of these kind of reform problems. This is the San Jose Police Department bragging on Twitter that they've done. There's this project called 8 Can't Wait, and they recommend these 8 police reforms to make the police better. People who are part of the communities I'm part of, we really oppose this project because these reforms don't work. But this is the San Jose Police Department being like, look, we did it all. We banned the chokeholds. We required de-escalation. They're just as brutal as they were before, the San Jose Police Department. But you can see how this works for the groups that that we're actually trying to target. Like, we want to defund the San Jose Police Department. We don't want to legitimize it. This is a kind of a response to that. This is an image from activists who are opposing that kind of thinking, talking about how the Minneapolis Police Department was held up as a model of progressive police reform when they killed George Floyd, right? So it's like they had mindfulness training for their cops. They had de-escalation training. They had implicit bias training. They had officer diversity. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, the stuff doesn't work. It's not designed to do anything but continue and legitimize and expand budgets of police. This is just horrifying image that I can't not show. Sorry for any nausea that I may be causing. The New York Police Department, probably one of the most famous sources of anti-queer, anti-trans violence in the world. Putting the symbols from our movement, the rainbow flag, on their car, to like lift up the good feelings that our liberation struggle provides, and put them onto their source of continuing violence against our community. So this is the kind of reform that doesn't provide any material relief, and that also does good PR for our opponents. And this is sometimes called pink washing. The term is sometimes called. Another version of this, right? Like police departments portraying themselves as homeless outreach teams, when what they're reaching out to do, and if you read the detailed text here, you don't need to, but basically they enforce violations of law, such as illegal camping and aggressive panhandling. So they criminalize homeless people, and they're like, look, we're officer friendly. Look, we're wearing bulletproof vests while we harass this unhoused person. This comic, I just feel like, also captures this, right? This idea that somehow having women be in the military or in combat is supposed to distract us from the brutality of what it is that the US military actually does. And I just recently saw this image on social media, which I just think really captures this, right? Like, that we see this so clearly. Like, it's not surprising in the US for liberals to be like equally pro-war, equally pro-police, but they want to like add a rainbow flag to it, or hire a trans person to drop these bombs, or say that they love Black people while they drop the bombs. Another piece of this puzzle, so like if we're living in this time period where we have seen a lot of these kinds of really, I'd say sophisticated, I would call them counterinsurgency tactics unrolled. I think really in the wake of the 1960s and 70s, anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, anti-war movements in the US, you saw this new strategy happening in US politics. I think there's similar things happening in Canada and elsewhere. But so not only did we see the emergence of these kinds of reforms that sort of say things have been taken care of while actually facilitating the expanding systems of extraction, we also see the rise of a huge nonprofit sector in that same period that actually, we're told to think of as the place that will solve the problems, but actually ends up being very system stabilizing. And so I'm not making a critique right now of people who work in nonprofits. I've done that a lot. It's a concern about the role that nonprofits take on in general in the system and the incentives that people who work there are forced to follow. Dylan Rodriguez, an anti-prison scholar who I admire a lot, talks about this system as sort of a carrot and a stick. So on the one hand, in the 60s and 70s movements and in the wake of those, it was very clear in the US context that if you did work that was actually going to get to root causes, then your group would be targeted for infiltration, your leaders would be assassinated and imprisoned. And many of those people are still in prison today, right? Whereas if you do work that is like crappy reforms and depoliticized social services that kind of keep things the same and don't really make much of a change, you can get money. And so that we saw this kind of really significant shift in social movements from mostly volunteer-based autonomous groups doing quite disruptive strategies to like a lot of people who got professionalized into nonprofits where you can get grant money if you do things that the government and wealthy funders think are palatable. And this has created a lot of like real siloing and lack of solidarity between different kinds of issues and tactics, so that lots of groups, it's like, oh, well, we do media watchdog stuff and you guys do try to stop fracking and the people over there are working on gay issues. I'm like, none of them shall ever meet. And nobody has each other's backs. And we're backing a candidate that we like because they're good on our issue, but we don't care if they're terrible on your issue. And it's very easy to divide us. And there's kind of there's no background politics. Like there's no background anti-capitalist politics or no background anti-white supremacy politics or anti-colonial politics, things that could actually do more than just like the smallest little interventions that are very comfortable for elites. These organizations, work under paid leadership of professionals. So they look a lot like businesses, they're designed like businesses, and they center the leadership of people with higher ed degrees, often lawyers. And so they have a really colonial dynamic that'll be like the white lawyer at the top makes 6 figures and the receptionist doesn't make a living wage, like all the same things as other businesses. There's like no connection to real justice there. And perhaps most concerning, they don't build people power. I mean, I should have said this at the beginning, but my real belief about how change happens is when millions of people are organized to force it to happen. It doesn't happen because elites like, oh my gosh, we didn't realize what we were doing was racist. Like that's not how it's going to work out. So these orgs don't build people power. They are like a small set of, people coming up with cool policy ideas, trying to push them through with elites. Like it's deeply non-disruptive. They don't build a base, as organizers would say. And perhaps most disturbing, because nonprofits need to keep getting funded, they're very unlikely to be like, our strategies don't work. Wow, we realized that things we keep trying to pass are never enforced, or we were trying to pass this law and it kind of got gutted, but we still have to celebrate when it passes because we need to look like we're the most important group doing this in our region. Like there's real incentive for them to not actually evaluate the strategies and figure out how to have winning strategies, but instead to just like keep the lights on, keep getting paid. So we're in a time of really extreme crises. As you all know, obviously we're living in a global pandemic. I live in a country where we have a very extreme crisis regarding that pandemic because we have a for-profit healthcare system, which is just like the worst possible idea you could ever have in terms of delivering people's healthcare. We are also living in a time of really bad housing crises almost everywhere that I hear of. Obviously, global climate change is producing many crises that are existential, including like the constant wildfires and floods and storms and blackouts. And we're just going to be seeing more of all that. We have the ongoing crisis that we're living in, the crisis of settler colonialism in the US and Canada, the crisis of racist policing and imprisonment. I mean, it's just, we're facing a lot of crisis, and it's very palpable. And so one of the results of that is that some of the institutions that cause these crises are having legitimacy crises, thank God, right? Like, and partly that's because our movements have pushed and exposed them. So I think that the US military is having a legitimacy crisis. And I think that police are having a legitimacy crisis in many places in the world, and extractive industries are having a legitimacy crisis. The oil and gas industry is having a very significant legitimacy crisis. The problem is, just because we provoke a legitimacy crisis does not mean that the next thing that happens is they tumble and fall, right? The other thing that can happen is that they recuperate. And that's what we've seen, I think, in the last 40 years, is that institutions like the US military, marriage, the police, et cetera, have recuperated by like including more people and having the kinds of reforms I talked about. So a big question for us is, how would we imagine taking the opportunity of these disasters and ruptures and crises and actually seeing it move us into dismantling the security state, the extractive industries, the things that are constitutive of our legal systems and of our countries. These moments of crisis are opportunities for mobilization. That's the best thing that can come from them, is tons and tons and tons of people becoming deeply involved in social movements. Not that they march once a year, not that they like things on social media, but that they actually start participating in their own communities in work for change. At the same time, people are very much, there's a big effort to demobilize us, to tell us to just click on something online, to tell us to just wait and vote, to tell us it's already been taken care of because they elected somebody to something who's a person of color, or something who's a woman or a queer person or something. There's so many efforts to demobilize us, to tell us either that it's already taken care of or that we're not the right ones to take care of it. Elites should do it, make a donation to a nonprofit, let somebody else do it, basically like to keep ordinary people in their places is kind of like a lot of what the demobilization is about. And I think most of the fantasies about the legal system are really like that. So in my own work, one of the things I've often done is like use some criteria to try to figure out, like, let's say we're part of a struggle, like here we are, we're living in a town together and we all hate that there's so many people in prison and we want to, get them out. And so if we might have to ask ourselves at times, like, okay, is a given tactic or reform actually good for our community, or is it just recuperating the system, right? So like right now, in the wake of the big uprisings that have been happening in the United States against policing, everywhere you go, they're trying to pass state laws that will do those terrible reforms I talked about earlier, like to ban the chokehold or something else that doesn't work, So we want to evaluate that. We want to have a conversation in our community of organizers, like, what do y'all think? Is this going to help us or not? Or if you're trans students on campus and you're so mad about what's happening to trans students on your campus, and then the school is like, okay, we'll pass an anti-discrimination policy. What was that what we wanted? Or did we want trans professors? And did we want trans healthcare at the health clinic? And did we want, right? So like really trying to figure out like, how do we assess reforms, and how do we have that juicy conversation in our organizing groups? Because it's not like it's always obvious. Like sometimes it's like, oh, I don't know, they've never tried that one before. Do we believe in that one? There's also like living and learning, but there's also a lot we've already learned about what doesn't work. So part of it is that, right, is actually like acknowledging, like learning from existing movements, talking to each other about what kinds of tricks that the system tries to play with reforms. So, I mean, the basic questions that I've been asking for years, not surprising. Does it provide material relief? Like, is anybody actually gonna get a place to stay out of this? Is anybody actually gonna get some healthcare out of this? Or is this just like the idea that these people are okay? Does it leave out an especially marginalized or stigmatized part of the group? A lot of terrible reforms are like, yes, this will help people unless you've been charged with a violent crime, or unless you have a criminal record, unless you're undocumented. So we want to obviously reject things that divide us in those ways. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle, for the reasons I already talked about? And does it mobilize the most effective for ongoing struggle? Because whatever we're fighting for obviously has a million incremental steps, right? Like if I'm fighting for prison abolition, which I am, then the incremental steps include everything from decriminalizing stuff to closing down jails and prisons, stopping new ones they're trying to build, getting people housing. All these things will move us towards prison abolition. So I want us to win wins that we won by getting a lot of people involved, and so that we're ready for the next fight and the next fight, not just a win behind closed doors between elected officials or people in bureaucracies, right? And so a lot of times lawyers are involved in those kinds of wins, and they're often not enforced because the community wasn't involved in them, and they're often thin, or they have loopholes. So we really want to ask, like, how did we get this win, and will it actually did it actually build the people power piece? Because the people power piece is like the central piece that's kind of left out of accounts of law reform. A couple other authors who I find interesting, their criteria, I just gather them in case these are interesting to you all. Peter Gelderlos, I love his work. I can't recommend it highly enough. He's a non-academic writer. His stuff is really accessible. I love his book, How Nonviolence Protects the State. I love his book, Anarchy Works. He's just a really thoughtful activist scholar. So he, in one of his books, he talks about the question, like, is it liberatory? Which I think is kind of a similar question to mine. One of his questions I love is, does it seize space in which new social relations can be enacted? I really love that because it makes me think a lot about things like the Occupy Wall Street moment, or the recent, in Seattle where I live during the summer, there was like the police left one of the precincts and there was like a police-free zone around it. And people were like building community gardens in the park and living outside and giving away free food to each other. And so this kind of part of it that's like, did people get together out and like do things that socially you're not supposed to do? Like, did we break the rules of don't share with each other and, you know, call the police on each other? You know, did we say we're not calling the police on each other, we're going to share everything? Like, did people actually live a new way in public together? I think it's a wonderful criteria. He asks, does it spread awareness of its ideas? He's not saying, does it have a hashtag? Did you see it on social media? It's like, did you start a chapter in your own town? Did you you're like, that's amazing, we're going to copy that and try it our way, right? Like Black Lives Matter chapters is an example of that, right? Does it have elite support? This is maybe his best question. He's like, if it has elite support, it's not liberatory. I think that's really amazing for those of us located in like law and policy work, because we're always like, oh my God, we got an elected official or a judge to say it was good. He's just like, if they say it's good, it's bad. I just love that. It's like a very like sobering reality. And then of course, does it achieve any concrete gains in improving people's lives? So kind of same as my material relief question. Another example of people doing this kind of thinking, Miriam Kaba, probably like the preeminent abolitionist, scholar, writer, activist in the United States. I highly recommend her work. She's got tons of stuff online. Around the time of Mike Brown's murder, she released this short article that I thought was so helpful that just demonstrates this kind of thinking, where she was asking, how do we know if a police reform is good or bad? And she was like, does it allocate more money to the police? If it does, don't do it. Does it advocate for more police and policing? Right? Like hire trans cops or hire de-escalation cops, or if it does, no. Put cops in schools, put cops in wherever, right? Is the reform primarily technology focused? I think that one is really useful as well, because of course we're told, oh, body cams will fix policing, which of course they don't, they're just used against defendants. Or we're told, we should have the cops have this other less lethal weapon, or whatever the case may be. And is it focused on individual dialogues with individual cops? Because she's like, this isn't really about changing cops' minds, policing as a system. I think it's a really useful criteria as well. And I want to also add Harsha Walia, who's part of No One Is Illegal, really a Canadian organization with multiple autonomous chapters, from which I've learned a lot. I really recommend her book, Undoing Border Imperialism. She asked this question that I think is like another way to put this conversation. Has the tactic been effective in exposing or confronting a specific point within the system by either diminishing its moral legitimacy or undermining its functions? So I love this. You know, what it makes me think of is, maybe some of you remember this. In 2008, there was a man named Laibar Singh who was going to be deported, and the Vancouver chapter of No One Is Illegal was organizing deeply around his case. And they organized about 2,000 people to go to the Vancouver airport and shut down the international terminal and prevent his deportation. It's just like, it both diminishes its moral legitimacy and it undermines its functions, right? And I think there's a lot of those kind of bold tactics that are increasingly present in our movements right now as these crises mount and get worse. So I want to talk a little bit about like sort of three main strategies that this work can include, just to kind of get us thinking about like, how do we do this work with this kind of thinking? And we can also talk about what the role of legal work might be in it. So one key kind of work, and I have a new book out about this, about mutual aid, which if you want to go way deeper, we can go way deeper, but I didn't focus on that for this talk. But one key kind of work that we have to do in movements that are trying to build people power and win real change is politicized survival work or mutual aid, right? So I'm distinguishing this from charity work or social services work, which is usually about trying to figure out like, who are the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and oh, you're not eligible for these services because you aren't sober, or because you have kids or you don't have kids, or you're undocumented. Like, it's like, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about usually volunteer-based mutual aid work that's based in solidarity and that believes that
the systems themselves are the problem, not the people who are living in crisis because of them. So this kind of work can include things like providing housing, healthcare, and education to each other. You know, like so many projects, people are trying to house people coming out of prison, or you know, I really love this project, Oakland Power Projects. It's based, but it's a project created by people in Oakland in Black neighborhoods where you can't call 911 for an ambulance because the police always come with them, and the police constantly are like hurting people when they show up when you called for an ambulance. And so people don't feel safe, of course, calling 911 when people are having medical problems. So Oakland Power Projects is training people in community to do acute healthcare, like gunshot wounds, to do mental health healthcare de-escalation, and to do chronic healthcare, like things like diabetes, so that people don't have to call 911 and can instead call each other, right? So like that's like such like on the ground, it's reducing harms because stopping the police from entering the community, and it's providing like these basic survival things that people need. And it's politicized, right? It's coming from a critique of policing. This also can look like supporting people who are getting eaten alive in the systems, right? So like actually supporting people in prisons and immigration proceedings and housing court. And I think especially when we do this in a deprofessionalized way, so instead of the way legal services typically look, which is like, we're gonna evaluate you, and there's, you know, 300 people who called this week and need help, and we can do 10 cases, and we're gonna pick the 10 best, which inevitably means the people who are the most stigmatized and have the worst problems are like not the ones who are getting the services. Instead, this is like community-based. So it might be volunteer lawyers, but also might be a lot of other people who are not lawyers who can be trained to do this work. It's kind of about deprofessionalizing the work and popularizing the work. Doing direct support for people with disabilities is an essential part of this, that there's a lot of in our communities, right? The kinds of support available through the existing systems are, you know, drastically inadequate, and I would argue murderous and genocidal. A couple examples of this kind of mutual aid work that inspire me. I really love this Moms for Housing work that was happening in Oakland. These are Black moms who occupied empty houses, basically squatted empty houses, in opposition to the lack of housing in Oakland. And then like a lot of other people were organizing with them and would stand outside at night and try to protect them from the police and try to, you know, guard the spaces. And there's been other work like this happening in Los Angeles and other areas. This kind of work really inspires me. This is like very politicized mutual aid work that is meeting immediate survival needs. This is another, this is based in Los Angeles. This is in January 2020. People blocking sanitation trucks that were coming to raid an encampment of unhoused people in a park called Echo Park. And so they kept blocking these trucks from raiding the encampment. I just think it's beautiful, people putting their bodies in front of these trucks. And it worked. And for about a year, the city was unable to raid the encampment. In March, the city spent $1 million to have a huge military style police raid, and raided the encampment and put a fence around the entire 16-acre park, which is pretty amazing. So I think we're really seeing the stakes are really rising with the housing crisis and the war between police and poor people. And I'm really moved by people both supporting people also supported the encampment at Echo Park by like bringing water and charging stations and food and tents and all of that stuff, and also by fighting the cops. Another thing I want to just name here is accompaniment projects, right? Like there's so much targeting and violence, and certainly against Muslim people, against trans people, against Asian people. And so, you know, people doing accompaniment to help people feel safer getting around, and also people accompanying each other to things like public benefits hearings and places like that, where people can end up being like, you know, feeling really alone and facing really life and death things without support. The second kind of work I want to talk about is dismantling work. So this is work where we're actually trying to get rid of the systems that are currently devouring our communities. So that includes all the local campaigns to reduce the police, to defund the police, to close prisons and precincts, to stop new building from happening. That's still very active work in my life. I don't know what that looks like where you all are, but like we're constantly fighting like another police station they want to build, and another jail they want to build, and another prison they want to build. It's like tons of work. And obviously the defund work at the local level across the US in the last year has been really significant, trying to, for the first time in my lifetime, shrink police budgets, which have only increased every year during my life. This work also includes blocking deportations and evictions and public housing closures, like people putting their bodies, which I think is also mutual aid work, like putting their bodies in front of these things. Like there's been a lot of like people blocking the doors of housing courts to stop evictions. So not just going into housing court people and trying to stop their eviction, but also just being like, there will be no evictions today. People, you know, surrounding people who ICE have come to arrest and not letting ICE get near them. You know, that kind of, you know, as part of a group that like we like laid down in front of the deportation buses at the detention center so that they couldn't drive people to the airports to deport them. In general, this is a period where I think we are going to be seeing more escalating tactics, and we actually really need that. We're seeing like people being bolder and bolder, and things, you know, part of why I want to really lift this up is that it's like the right thing to do is often to break the law, right? To squat the house, to block the deportation, right? It's not the legal channels are fruitless. And like, in that case, what do? You're not going to like pass you're not going to be the one who wins the lawsuit that makes everybody free. It's just not going to happen through the colonial racist legal systems that we live under. And then the third real type of work, obviously all of these are overlapping, is the work to build the world that we want. And that includes preparing for disasters. Like there are disasters that have already been set in motion that we can't stop now, right? Like the climate disasters that are coming, like the next fire season is going to be really, really bad in the West Coast of the US, or the next hurricane season. Like the fact that we're going to see a lot more blackouts, like the things that really like endanger people's lives on so many levels, both during the storm or the fire, but also like all the cascading effects afterwards. So we need new social relations to be able to survive. And we also need to prepare for the disasters that are still unfolding. And there's a lot of different pieces to this. A big part of this work that I'm happy to talk a lot more about if people are interested is all the work people are doing and have been doing to respond to violence without police. So that includes work to prevent violence, right? Which policing does not prevent violence, it produces violence. But like, what would prevent violence? Like there is violence in our communities. So, you know, in some communities that means we're doing healthy dating and relationship skills classes for teenagers so that they can be less likely to have the high rates of domestic violence that are throughout our society. Or we're doing, I'm thinking about a group in Seattle that I really admire called Corner Greeters. They are people who hang out in the corner in their own community, and their black community, black people in that community hang out on the corners where the most police action happens, and just be kind and friendly, try to create a community vibe in the places where the most like violence and harm happens, right? And just trying to change the dynamics of isolation that face a lot of people, and trying to meet people where they're at and be supportive. So like things like that, you know, there's tons of different violence prevention work, right? And mostly like our police and criminalization system can't think about prevention at all. It just thinks about like punishment, right? The second element is how to respond to things that do happen in our communities without the police. So how, like when somebody's doing something to people in our communities, in our friend circle, on our campus, how do we get them to stop without using the police? Since the police don't really make it stop, right? They often show up afterwards and either say that nothing has happened, or they throw the book at somebody, and then that leads to further violence, you know? So what does that look like? What do people need to stop doing the violence? Does this person have a substance abuse issue they need help with? Do they have a mental health issue they need help with? Do they need more ways to think about race and gender? Like, what do they need to stop doing this thing and to cut it out and to feel like a social pressure to stop? And then also the tools to stop. And what are the people who they've hurt need to be able to participate in life again? Can't make it not have happened, but what do people need to truly be supported to heal, which is of course not something that the system provides at all. And the third piece is always to ask, like, what conditions let this happen generally? So what are the overall conditions that we all participate in that could change what's happening, right? So it's like, you know, an example of this is I was part of a group in which we were trying to respond to the fact that queer health clinic had to close because the executive director had a gambling problem and stole all the money. And so we had the question, we're like, okay, well, what lessons have been learned here? Like, how can groups handle money in ways that doesn't make this likely to happen? Can we try to change this for all future groups? What is needed about how to have lots of people looking at the books so that somebody could never get away with selling this much money, even if they're going through a crisis of an addiction, you know? And so like kind of looking at the broader context, or obviously, you know, being trans, it's like, why are so many trans women of color being killed? Well, you know, what would probably stop the most of that death is housing. Like having people have stable housing is probably the number one thing that would reduce those deaths. So thinking about the broad, like what would actually prevent violence. This work, you know, the building the world we want work is about care and independency. It's interdependency. It's really about, you know, those things have been devalued because that's like women's work in our society, and often the work of women of color specifically. So really shifting to an ethic of care and interdependency. It's also about like people growing and changing by politically participating. And when people's political participation is passive, they're just like, oh, I read articles about what's going on at the border, or I read an article about prisons, and then I clicked on stuff. People have a very narrow view of it often, and often it's about whatever's palatable or whoever deserves help. Whereas when people actually participate in mutual aid and participate in organizing in their communities, inevitably it gets more complicated. We engage with each other differently. We learn things that we don't already know about the issues and about who's involved and about the stakes. And so, and a lot of, organizing groups and mutual aid groups intentionally make political education part of our work. We're like, hey, like we're all going to talk about disability justice on Saturday. We're all going to watch this documentary together. We're all going to think about how our work here connects to what's happening in Palestine or whatever. Like the political education is, and growing our solidarities by participating in community. So not just by like reading the right things, but by being in a group where people are like, it's cool to care about this. And then I'm like, I want to be cool. I want to be part of this group. I want to be liked. I want to meet my own social needs. I want to feel a part of something. I want to see it modeled how deep passion and acting on purpose makes life beautiful, and it's a different, it's just about moving out of these more passive roles. And then the final piece is, I think, this value that's so essential to all of this work is the idea that no one is disposable. And that's the opposite of the values of extractive systems, right? Which make almost everybody disposable for the enrichment of very, very few. And I think COVID shows that so clearly, right? That like old people are disposable, people with disabilities are disposable. It's just like, let those people all die. The most important thing is that, business as usual go on and everybody can make a buck. And so I think, this is a pretty big, it's a tall order that requires us both to like imagine a completely different society and also imagine ourselves quite differently, because we have all been trained deeply in disposability. So with that, I will show you this image that I love from this wonderful artist, Seth Tabachman. To me, this image really is about letting go of our fantasy that the governments are going to rescue us from the crises we're in, and instead just, rolling up our sleeves and helping each other survive. So I'm excited to talk to you all about all these things. I'm going to see if I can make there be more light in this house also. The sun went down while I've been talking.
Thank you, Dean. Wonderful. You've given us a lot to think about as people get their questions ready. And if you joined us a little ways through, any questions, please pop them into the chat, and then I will relay them as they come through. But as folks are wonderful. So Jack has a question here. I know that I recognize a lot of names on the call here. So Dean, for your information, we have a lot of folks from activist communities in both Saskatoon and Regina. I'm sure there are people from other locations as well. But it's really, I know that there's a lot of folks that are very, very directly engaged in a lot of the things that you addressed in your talk. So Jack's question is, yes. This is hopeful for what radical change can look like in Saskatchewan. So speaking to that, as other people get their questions together, I have a question to kind of get things started. One thing that really stuck out to me was the question from Peter Gelderlos. Does it see space in which new social relations can be enacted? In a world in which so many things are immaterial, laws are immaterial, policies, politics, right? And we often forget about the body or the physical space and the material aspects. And so that really struck me as a significant piece. So I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's helpful even also for us to remember, when was a time you felt you went somewhere like that, or did something that did that, that you were in a space, that you were in like a queer party space in which people were like, it's hot to be fat, or like, it's hot to be genderqueer, or something like just all the, it could be something that was social and transformative, but also like broke your isolation or met a deep need, or what made you think like, oh my God, I can think this new thought that I couldn't think before. I could have this other practice. And so I think there's a lot of things, there's some really good discussions about how this happens in moments of looting and rioting that I think are really useful. I love this new book by this trans author, Vicky Osterweel. The book is called In Defense of Looting, and I highly recommend it just to anyone. It really, it's a huge, indictment of the idea that we should all be peaceful protesters, and it's really great. But one of the things she talks about is like this moment where you're like, we all live in capitalism, and then people are just like, no, we're just taking all the shit. And like how joyful it is and how liberatory it is. And I love that example. I've also I was just teaching the book Standing with Standing Rock which has some really amazing accounts of the kinds of transformative space that the camps at Standing Rock were. And I think I've seen that also at things like the occupied protest or zone, or it's also called the police free zone that happened in Seattle last summer. Like that, when people are just like in public together, like refusing the rules, it can kind of break you open and make you be able to like see any glimpse of what another value system or life could be. And I think that people have that sometimes through art practices or through other community practices as well. But my examples are mostly about like encampment protest spaces where people are just like sharing stuff and like teaching each other a lot about what their own struggles are and why they resist the police and whatever. And I some of Peter Gelderlos's examples in that book, that's from his book, The Failure of Nonviolence. He talks about like the M15 movement in Spain, which was like happening in public squares. He talks a bit about Occupy. But yeah, I think it's kind of a fun question. It's such an evocative question also to just ask ourselves, like, where have I experienced it? It might be something small sometimes that happened like on campus even, you know, that was where it just felt like, oh my God, we all just broke the rules, you know, and it was freeing.
To your point here, Nicole White has shared, and I think that this is a wonderful piece of information. Idle No More was originally founded here in Saskatoon by four Indigenous women, a settler woman, and so Idle No More has a very feminist, two-spirit based underpinnings, and it's something that has really stuck with it as it has continued to be a very embodied, visceral, engaged movement. So Jack's question here: what are some strategies for radical change that we can use without having critical mass that we often see in the media when describing radical transformative actions? We often lack that critical mass in Saskatchewan, especially with regards to things like anti-oil and gas activism or queer activism or anti-colonial actions. Very good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that's true everywhere. Like in the US and Canada, our movements are remarkably small compared to, and it makes sense because it's like belly of the beast stuff, you know? But I think that to me, that's not a problem because any work, no matter how small, does it. So like, I mean, you know, I go to sometimes to like small towns and various places where people are just like doing the direct support at the encampment of unhoused people, or I'm in a place where people are like a really far-flung place. It's happening. It's regularly in Canada. People are like laying down on the railroad tracks in front of coal trains, or like refusing to allow an area to be logged or whatever. And so that oftentimes they're calling on others to come join them from other places, which can be, I think, a meaningful strategy. But I think like sustained resistance in our local space, that sometimes, you know, sustained resistance, as I'm sure you all know, because you're all doing it, it's like, it's often not very glamorous. It's like, yeah, we're just continuing on. And then you don't know when the thing is going to pop off. Like you just like, I never would have guessed that last summer would be when all this abolition work that I've been doing for 20 years, like people would like pop off and it would become like, you know, a normal thing to be discussed in elite media, the idea of abolition or the idea of defunding the police. Like none of us knew that. You just do the work in whatever ways, which sometimes feel quite small or sometimes feel like, and then the other piece is like, how do we just make pathways for new people to join? Like that, if we want to build people power, we have to be less interested in being right and more interested in being welcoming, you know, and that's really hard for leftists. You know, we're like, we love to be like, I know more about blah, blah, blah. And so how do we create a welcoming culture that's like, yes, you can come in even if you don't know this yet, or even if you haven't signed on to this yet, or you use different words, and we're not going to like abandon our politics because you showed up. It's not like we're just like, oh yeah, no, we didn't mean it. We're not abolitionists because someone here isn't, but instead like, oh no, this is what we believe in and you're welcome here. And maybe you're not an abolitionist, but you agree that we shouldn't have this jail. Or maybe you're like, you know, not really mad at the oil and gas industries, but you're mad at this one plant because it's going to be near your house or something. And so that's how you radicalize people, is you like invite them in with what they care about right then, you know, and then hopefully build meaningful relationships where you talk about and demystify other parts of the politics. And they're like, oh, actually, yeah, I do care about those people. Or I never knew them before, but now I met them through the group. And now I actually really care about their well-being. And so I'm growing my muscle of solidarity that this society tells me not to grow and to like numb out to other people's pain and agony, you know? So yeah, I think that like so much of social movement history is about actually pretty small groups of people being willing to keep saying the radical thing and keep putting it in practice in public. And that then there being like this moments of alignment where more people are able to join it or can get it or can see it. And I think there's like something really beautiful about being willing to be out there on that limb, you know, and it doesn't mean you're irrelevant. I mean, I just, you know, I feel like I spent so much of my life and people just be like, well, your politics is unrealistic. No one will ever care about abolition. It's like, well, I'm sorry. Now people suddenly care about it. Like, I don't know, you know, or like years and years of doing trans politics where trans stuff mainstreamed. And I'd say that's actually not gone well, you know, like when your thing mainstreams, it's usually kind of bad news too, because it's just like a very thin, politically evacuated version circulates. But it's still an opportunity to reach more people to have a conversation about what it really means and what the liberation you're imagining really is. It's not like the, you know, corporate version or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I don't have any like answers except for that we have to like believe we can recruit endless numbers of people to it. And then we have to be kind of like, just keep showing up, you know, like it's kind of like half of it.
Mm-hmm. Our next question here from Lou, I think that you've started to, or I have already spoken to this question here, which is how do we bring people to the same page? For example, some people may want more radical police in jails. Some people may prefer relying on police force rather than responding to violence by themselves. So speaking to that, those differences there that are sometimes complicated and sometimes openings.
Yeah, I mean, we're having that right now. A lot of people in the US are like, I want to see cops punished. You know, I want to see cops prosecuted. And then there's a lot of us who are like, yeah, unfortunately, like the system isn't designed to do that. So even if once in a while it does that, that's not going to get rid of our police violence problem at all. Like it's definitely like, it actually can operate unhindered while continuing to, you know, once in a while prosecute a cop. It's really deep because we are all, you know, we're all socialized to believe that these systems are that we need them, that people are bad and selfish, and that if we don't have them to protect us, then we'll get hurt, that the police could be good if only they just hired someone different or trained them differently. And I think the way that I think about that is just what I said, just like starting with people with whatever they already believe in. So a lot of people are like, yes, I think the police do target people of color too much or something. And so then I always just start conversations with people with like whatever they actually are behind. And then I share why. A lot of people don't know the history of reform. So I might share like, oh yeah, that, you know what, they actually tried that in this state for the last 30 years. It didn't work. And they should get cost more money or whatever. I'll just share the parts that might be useful and listen a lot to what they're thinking. And I think that the piece of, and then just keep doing the work publicly. I mean, one example of this is that in like 2012, the county I live in decided to build a new youth jail. And they had the one Black county council member be like the face of the project. And the idea was that it's so bad for the youth in the jail and they don't have good air conditioning or whatever. We need to rebuild this jail. It's so dilapidated. And they're going to rebuild the court buildings too. The point of the project was actually build new chambers for the judges. Like that's who actually wanted it, but they framed it as it'll be good for the kids. And so I was part of this, you know, organizing group trying to fight the new jail. And for years, we'd go to all the big nonprofits in town that supposedly do racial justice, supposedly do like youth justice. And they were all just like, no, we can't oppose the youth jail. No, it's being, you know, promoted by that guy and we trust him. And yeah, it sounds like it's good for the kids. And we're like, could going to jail be good for kids? I thought that you were trying to get the kids out of the jail and whatever. And it just years of going back to them and never stepping down from what we believed. And we were running the campaign, all grassroots, nobody's getting paid. And then all these, you know, sort of more elite orgs are all resisting us. And we just kept doing it. We blocked the construction with our bodies. We got, you know, huge sign-on letters of educators and artists and healthcare workers. And we just like relentlessly harassed the county about building this jail and tried to get it in the news constantly and tried to stop it with our bodies as they started building it. And eventually all those orgs came around and signed on. It took them 6 years of us inviting them over and over again and showing the politics over and over again. And a lot of that was individual relationships with people about what risks they were willing to take and whether or not they actually could imagine a world where we didn't put kids in jails, which is so sad, you know? And I just learned a lot from that about that combination of firmness and invitingness. I wasn't like, oh, you said, no, I'm writing you off. You suck. You like jails. You're bad. But I was like, wow, we disagree with you. We're going to keep on fighting this. And we're going to keep inviting you to join the fight. And they eventually did. And then they built the jail. But then when they tried to build the next thing, all those people were already against it. And now we can get them to sign on to anything to stop any jail or any criminalizing law. And I think we're also going to use that same coalition to get them to close down the jail that's only been open for a year. So, which, you know, we have a lot more power to do that now that people have been in the streets. That's the other thing, is that people in the streets really change those things right away. And so to me, it's just like, that was a big lesson about keeping that door open, but also not shying away from being like, you're publicly not resisting this jail. That's really too bad. That's really out of step with your mission. And I care about you and respect you, and I'll be back. And I'm not like, there's a backbone in it, you know? And I just, you know, I think that the other piece of this is when new people enter our orgs, and I've been in tons of orgs where new people enter and they like say something really anti-immigrant, or they're really transphobic, just like, they're just new, you know? And it's like, yes, I've had all those thoughts. I've said all those things. I've done all those things. We all have. And so how can we be like, we're so glad you hear it. You know, you might not know that, like, that word hurts people, and this is why. And I know you don't want to hurt people, you know, and just like really loving and not publicly humiliating and not to take down, and an invitation to and knowing that it might be a while, it might be slow, you know, like these are big ideas when you live in this kind of programming. This is probably all just really obvious, but this has just been my experience of just kind of like sustained engagement. And one of the things that's happening right now, since I wrote the book about mutual aid, a lot of mutual aid groups are contacting me, and a lot of them are people, you know, they just started in last year, and they're people who've never done any political activism before. And one of the things a lot of them say is like, is it okay for us to like have this really bold message when we're doing this like support at this encampment or some other kind of grocery runs or whatever, COVID-19 mutual aid? Like, are we proselytizing? And I'm like, yeah, it's great for you to have like a housing for all message, or a like, you know, defund the police message while you're giving out water. Absolutely. Like, you're not a nonprofit that like is afraid of losing your funders. You're a bunch of volunteers. Like, say your message, like give somebody a bottle of water, and that you're not saying you can't have this water unless you also want to defund the police. You're saying, here's some water and we want to defund the police. Like, and inviting a conversation, like not being afraid to have teeth, you know, not feeling like you have to be defanged in the work we're doing. Or make it palatable, even while we're like loving, you know, like that combination, I think is, it's not seen a lot on the left, because we also see a lot of like, you know, mean girl behavior, like kind of, you know, like who's the smartest, who's the coolest stuff.
Thank you. Marilyn Poitras. Marilyn, I'm gonna, hopefully I get your question correct here. Marilyn says, thank you for this great insights. In my work with regarding lack of safety and security for Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2S people, I see the needs as so basic: safe bathroom, place to sleep, place to cook, and then layering on top of that, access to education, healthcare, employment. But the other issues we're actually working within are institutional oppressive practices done so often without reflection. I'm trying to separate these to say, stop blaming the sisters and get your own stuff together. Comments?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate what you're saying, because it's like every social problem, every kind of violence that we're also worried about, like almost all of it just comes down to like if people had like housing, childcare, healthcare. It's just like, it's so intense, you know? And then there's this idea like we need the police. We need to spend 50% of every city's budget on the police because the children are suffering, or because the women are suffering, you know, always. And then it's just like, no, like actually what people need. And I don't know if this is part of what you're thinking about in your comment, but what it brought up for me is like at shelters and other kinds of like spaces that are supposed to support people experience so much of the same violence. Like I would say most homeless shelters in US cities are basically essentially jails. And like women's shelters are transphobic and leave out trans women, and people experience so much racism in these spaces. It's like, there's the whole model of social services and the nonprofit is so much about controlling and blaming poor people and regulating them, instead of just being like, oh, you need a place to stay. Here's an actual place to stay where you get to close the door and lock it. You know, it's just all about these congruent spaces that are totally dehumanizing, and then just it's just pathologizing people for being in crisis and being like, oh, there's something wrong with you. You need more, you know, your mental health isn't correct. Whereas like, if you're rich, you can just be like totally abuse your children. It's fine. You can use as many drugs as you want. You can, you know, like we know that this has like the idea that people who are safe because they have more capacity, right? Not to mention, we know that trauma, when people are going through trauma, they're, you know, they lose a lot of those capacities. All of us do. And then we need to be caught and loved and cared for by our communities, not like labeled and stigmatized. So one of the things I've struggled with a lot in my life is how to work with people and institutions that are providing that stuff and try to make them better, you know? And I think part of me is like, in some ways they're designed to be bad. Like they're designed to be underfunded and to like, you know, kick people out easily and to have those kinds of, you know, anti-drug logics and stuff like that. And so we need community mutual aid projects that can actually do this, can model how it should be done. And I still believe in doing the harm reduction work of trying to like get women's shelters to let trans women in, or like trying to get them to have a different attitude about current drug users or about people going through a psychiatric crisis than the, you know, it's not to not ban people for life. It's like all of these horrible things. And so I think that is just another one of those. It's also like, they're like, how do I want to use my time and energy? Like if I'm just butting my head up against the wall, trying to change an institution that's not going to change, I'm better off maybe just like doing the mutual aid work to provide the thing right now. And I think that some of us get stuck just trying to beat down that door that's got, you know, so many norms behind it that it's not gonna, other times I've seen people like take over those organizations and change them, you know, like I think it's like doing that assessment of what's possible. Like, I don't believe you can take over the prosecutor's office and change it, but like maybe the like purportedly feminist women's shelter that is not doing things in a way that we believe is actually feminist and anti-racist, like sometimes we can take that over or like shift its norms. And it takes more than one person to do that. It has to be an organizing effort, and it's very sustained hard work.
So you just spoke of harm reduction, which leads perfectly into our next question. Locally, and this has been a big part of the conversation for many months, but particularly in the last couple of weeks, a number of organizations have been supporting a local organization. And so Elise says, I work for a local business, Turning the Tide bookstore. Big shout out to an incredible bookstore, an incredible anarchist bookstore in Saskatoon that is among several in the city, raising funds to keep prairie harm reduction operating. And Prairie Harm Reduction is a safe consumption site that just opened in Saskatoon. Our provincial government continues to refuse to fund this safe site that serves a number of vulnerable people dealing with addiction. And so today, I think the list is probably 40, 50 different organizations, individuals, artists have publicly donated and are running campaigns and fundraisers to support prairie harm reduction. So that's part of the backstory here. And so the question is, how can we continue to apply pressure to our right-wing government to fund this very important initiative?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I really wish I was visiting you all in person so I could go to this cool anarchist bookstore. It's like the most fun thing you could ever do on a visit to a town. Yeah, I think this is such a deep one. So like, because it really brings up this question, like when we do get funding for the things we think are necessary, they can always revoke it and also add strings. So I'm not like we should never do that, but it's an interesting dilemma. Like it's a dilemma we're facing in the work to defund the police, because we're like, let's defund the police and put that money towards childcare, healthcare, and housing. But also we all know that all such like poor relief programs are always like full of strings, leave out the most marginalized people in our communities. You know, like that is how poor relief is designed in capitalist countries. It's designed to ensure that people will stay desperate enough to work for any wage under any conditions. And it's designed to keep out immigrants and to keep out trans people or whatever, to keep out hated people and to maintain those stigmas. So like, I think this is an interesting question whenever we touch like how to get government funding for things. It's just like, if we do get government funding for something, then the fight has just begun, because we need to maintain that level of organizing ongoing, to make sure it's properly funded, to make sure that the funding isn't revoked. You know, like I think about this a lot with like the pink tide in Latin America, you know, the period where a lot of Latin American countries elected like leftist governments, but they had to maintain these huge social movements that had organized to create those leftist governments, like labor and women's movements and landless people's movements, in order to hold those people's feet to the fire so that they actually did the things they said they were going to do and that you elected them to do. Like the dilemma, I think, and I've seen this happen in some cities, is like people are really organizing around some kind of project and finally get it institutionalized through the city government or the provincial government or whatever. And then everyone kind of dies down with the activism, and then they can just destroy it whenever they want, whenever there's a budget cut or whenever there's austerity or whenever the next government comes into play and they want to target it or whatever. And so that's like, I think just like a question, like, how do we not rely on the government given the ways that it is structured to like leave certain people out and to and to really, the job of the US and Canadian government is to facilitate colonial extraction. Like that's its actual job. And anything we get it to do beside that is likely just because for a minute they didn't think it was a contradiction or they thought it was the best way to shut us up. So like, how can we go into these negotiations and these efforts knowing that? And so that also the campaign that you're doing to get it funded is also transforming the community such that it will always be defended by the community. Like that part about like mobilizing people for the next fight and the next fight, because the next fight and the next fight are coming, right? And so whatever we're doing, did it strengthen our community so much that even if the government takes the thing away, we're going to make sure it's provided, and the other things that aren't provided, that it's like, we're ready now to fight for the safe consumption space, but also like housing for all, or whatever the 10 other big things are that would actually make the people who are using the safe consumption space safer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question from Heather here. Another comment: this has been an encouraging and engaging conversation. I appreciate how we're encouraged to think about needs being met and prevention of harm. As someone who works in you've said a lot about nonprofit, and I know there's a lot of buzz around that, right? As someone who works in a nonprofit organization that is supported financially by elite people, we often work at getting them to be involved in advocacy and change movements. If we are inviting in the elite, are we jeopardizing these reform movements?
I just put a book in the chat that I really recommend as kind of a great source on this question. It's an anthology by this woman of color feminist organization about this very question. There's lots of good stuff in there, reflecting on different aspects of how nonprofitization has impacted. One of the insights of that book that's so important is that any work we're paid to do, we're being paid because elites have decided it's okay to pay for that work to happen. You know, any work that we're paid to do through an institution, right? Like that through the university, through a nonprofit. And so just knowing the limits of that. So like, then what's the proper relationship to that? You know, like some people would say the proper relationship to working at the university is theft. Like, what can I get out of here for other people, you know, who are left out of this? Or the proper relationship to the nonprofit might be like, it's just like strategic. It's like, okay, what are the ways that this organization's horizons are limited by its relationship with elites? And that doesn't mean that every elite person is a bad person. It's not about that. You know, it's about the structural situation and like, how much of my life am I devoting to trying to get elite people to think differently? And what is it I believe that is doing in terms of how social change will happen? So for me, it feels very clear that social change happens through people power, and that particularly young working class people and people of color are the most likely to take the biggest risks to make the biggest change. Like there's been a long history of that in the movements I study. So that doesn't mean other people don't, but wow, there's something really important about supporting those people's organizing. There's something really important about working class people, about indigenous people. Like these people are the people with the like most to lose in the current system and the least to lose through change, who are like who often have the biggest wisdom about how the current system works and what it means to take it down. And so for me, I mean, I've done a lot of fundraising in my life also with elites, but I'm always trying to balance like, how am I using my time? What's the right way to both strategically engage elites and not start thinking that elites are going to get us out of this, because like they're the least likely to get us out of this, you know? And so I think that, yeah, that's just like a question, like, how, you know, one way I've thought about this and written about this in the past is that like, if we see our movements have, like I got the idea from the Miami Workers Center, this idea that there's different pillars of social movements. There's like the pillar of service, like any kind of work we're doing to help people survive right now. There's a pillar of law and policy, like stuff to try to address all the things that are in the laws. There's the pillar of consciousness, stuff that's trying to like transform how people think about ideas, and how people think about the prisons, or how people think about women, or whatever it is. And then there's the pillar of power, and their argument, and that's where you're actually like building up big bases of people who can resist. And that pillar is the most important pillar that needs to be fed and be part of all the other pillars' work. But in contemporary neoliberal times, that pillar is invisible. That's the one that's not funded. Like organizing work is like the thing that's like not named. It's a part of social change that's like gone from the story. And so for me, that the lesson there is that no matter what kind of work I'm doing, it should be organizing work. Like whatever I'm doing, is it actually engaging more and more people to actively take up a role? in the work, and to build like thick relationships where they feel empowered to do actual transformative change. And I think mutual aid is like a really good on-ramp for that kind of work, for getting people into movements. And I think it's usually the most typical on-ramp for people into social movements. But work, like, so then that question of like, if I'm working with elites, is there any chance that it's building people power? Or how can it become something that builds people? You know, just asking those kinds of questions for me has been useful to try to figure out, because of course in our society, like working with elites is what you're supposed to do, like, get more money behind it. But I see a lot of groups make lots of change without money. And I actually have seen a lot of groups get most destroyed, but as soon as they get money, like things are going really well, and then they get an influx of money, often from elites who are like, wow, that is amazing. And then there's like tons of fighting, and like, you know, or they stop doing the real work and start doing something else. And a couple people get rich, you know, just like, and so I'm curious about also, can we imagine getting this stuff done without elites? Just as an idea experiment. I don't believe in absolutism around this, but I am curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My dog is snoring beside me, so sorry about that. But I know that Elise made a note. Yes, so if anyone on the call here is looking for any of Dean's books, definitely they are at Turning the Tide. And Elise would invite you to, if next time that you're in Saskatoon, you can come sign your books. But Natasha has a question. We recognize that our governments are built upon and built to maintain systems of oppression that benefit themselves. But ultimately, is there a vision of government where it is no longer the enemy or the thing we need to work around? Is there a government that we can see as a partner in the world we want to build? And do you have any good resources to check out for people who've articulated that kind of government?
I am an anarchist. So I think that the nation state form itself was designed for extraction. It developed with capitalism and white supremacy and slavery and settler colonialism. And so I believe that like this form that we live under, that we might call government, is specifically about like conquering a territory and like redistributing within that territory. So taking from most people and giving it to a small number of people, like upwardly redistributing. And I don't think that form of control can be liberatory. However, governance, like how do we actually make decisions together and have collective self-determination? Oh yeah, like there's totally better ways, you know, than the ones we live under, right? And so I think there's a lot of ways I think about that. One part of it, I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but the idea of like decentralizing. So like one example of this is that like the whole state of California, the energy is all done through PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. And PG&E is this giant company. And when they do a really bad job, they use really extractive forms of energy, and they also like can't maintain their infrastructure well. And so they caused the really brutal Camp Fire that killed a lot of people in California in 2018. And they've caused other fires. And as soon as the fire happens and it's clear that PG&E is the cause, the state of California immediately passes legislation that you can't sue PG&E about it, right? So the government protects PG&E's ability to continue to extract, right? And so then like people like Naomi Klein, a famous Canadian, have argued that we should have instead like local control over our energy grids. Like we should get to decide in our county or in our city, we don't want to have energy from coal, or we don't want to have energy from fracking or whatever. And we should have, so that's a conversation about moving from like these kinds of big standardized forms of control where you have no choice to like collective self-determination. And so I think there's, you know, obviously in a lot of Canadian law schools, people study Indigenous law. So like that's obviously a huge basis for research for thinking about other ways of living together, because people have lived on these lands for thousands of years, not governing themselves, using cages, militarized borders, and extractive industries. So like there's definitely lots of ways to do it. I think a lot of us also look at different contemporary resistance movements. Like a lot of us study the Zapatistas, right? Like Indigenous people, trying to push back against the anti-Indigenous realities of living under the Mexican state, taking land, defending it in an armed way, having a feminist movement that produces decision-making across groups of people in ways that don't have like an elected leader or that kind of representative politics, but instead participatory politics. So, like coffee growers are meeting in their circle, and parents are meeting in their circle, and people who work at the health clinic are meeting in their circle, and they're all sending representatives to a meeting with all those bodies. And like that's like a very different way. People are also looking at this in Rojava, the recent kinds of governance practice in Rojava. So I think there's like, I would actually recommend Peter Gelderlos's book, Anarchy Works, for this. He really helps you picture other ways that people make decisions together. Also, Cindy Milstein has a new book called Deciding for Ourselves that looks at specific instances where large groups of people have made decisions about how to do things that are in different ways. Because I think this is kind of the big decision. I wrote about this in my mutual aid book, like just learning how to make decisions together without like somebody being the boss is like not something most of us have gotten to do, because in our families, there's people getting bossed around, and at school and at work, like almost none of us have gotten to be in meetings where the goal was to have everybody really be heard and to want to hear each other and come up with like the best wisdom from the group, instead of just like, well, I'm the executive director and I say it's going to roll out this way, or I'm the principal or the teacher or the dad or whatever, or, you know, the priest or whatever it is. So I think that like, this is a big deal. Like it means that we have to imagine that people actually can work collaboratively together, but we live under systems that tell us that we need bosses, which is like so scary and wrong. And it means that we then also have to practice those skills. Like, and I think it's interesting to look at, where do I already have those skills? Like, I think a lot of us practice this best in friendship. Like we do a really bad job in blood families and romantic relationships. Those are not places usually for models of this, but friendship is a place where a lot of times we practice consensus with our friends, or we like are willing to receive feedback, or we're interested in the wisdom of the group instead of just like getting my way. I mean, not all of us. Friendships can also be harmful spaces and spaces of domination. But yeah, this question about governance is huge. And to me, it's about shaking off the ways in which we're currently heavily controlled. Like we have like the boot of the cops on our neck as we try to like fight to save humanity from climate change, and as we try to like get housing for people, like, and we're like constantly being taxed for their wars. I mean, like everything is, you know, people are made to work at the like meanest possible wage, doing the most dangerous work. You know, like the people who make the things can't have the things. I mean, it's really deep, the levels of control we're under, and those are facilitated by our legal systems. That's what our legal systems in our countries are for. And so trying to imagine like what we could have if we both didn't have the boot on our neck, and also like we're interested in co-governing together, stewarding land, water, work, childcare, all the things that are part of our lives that right now are like, we have such vexed, extractive relationships to, that are causing so much pain and so much isolation.
Thank you. Marilyn is dreaming about Indigenous laws where foundations are connecting kinship and responsibility and reciprocity. Just imagine. I think that we have no further questions in the chat, and I think that is a really powerful imaginary to close on. So I want to say a huge thank you, Dean, for joining us tonight. Thank you to the folks behind the scenes, helping to even Zoom talks require a behind the scenes team. So thank you to you for helping out. I know from working in both the nonprofit sector and with students in human rights and gender studies that we're often caught in the juxtapositions of outrage and those feelings of apathy or powerlessness. And I definitely feel as though, and I can see it from the conversation and through the chat, that you've given us more than anything strategies, tangible strategies, things that we really can do, possibilities that we can see and feel in the communities around us. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. And so for those on the call, don't forget to join us for our final talk on Wednesday from 3:30 to 5 with Mayor Charlie Clark, Ben Bourne, and lawyer Jill Bishop as they discuss the next steps following Saskatoon's ban on conversion therapy. The link to these events can be thrown into the chat, I think, if someone can, I think Kira or Rory, if you can pop that in there, that would be wonderful. And otherwise, Dean, you have also given us an incredible reading list. I love good sources, and I saw people are already pulling things out of the library. You can go to Turning the Tide to find some of these books. And as I said, this talk was recorded, so you can go back through and gather an incredible reading list from there. Thank you again, Dean.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.
Yeah, much appreciated. There's the link in the chat, and to everyone, thank you for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.